This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, today we have the distinct pleasure to have Michal Murawski and also Khadija from Zinnenburg to present on their work in relation to house arrest today. But the duo is quite an extraordinary duo in terms of basically bringing together anthropology and art history together in relation to the topic of house arrest and the project that they basically have been working on and they're going to be presenting today in terms of their work. And just to sort of reiterate, there are a number of events that's related to the work of the two speakers that might be of interest to the group. If any of you might happen to be in Dublin at any point
in April, all of April.
And all of April, yes. And Khadija will be having an exhibition there in relation to opera houses in colonial settings. It's a video work, if I'm not mistaken. A video work, but also, as I understand, is basically building up on your recent book in relation to understanding of art in the time of the colony, which has just come out by Ashgate Publishers. And Khadija just moved over from Cambridge to UCL, art history. So having gone over from the Institute, from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, where she has been working, and thankfully to us here at UCL. So hopefully we're looking forward to more collaboration along these lines, and hopefully more collaboration along with Michal, who's London European Studies, an anthropologist who's worked extensively on basically the ethnography of urban settings, previously having worked in Poland, particularly in Warsaw, and now working in Moscow, particularly in terms of the construction of the new sections or neighborhoods that are under construction in Moscow at the present. But now the two of them are very much involved in this question of domestic house arrest in a sense, and I'm looking quite anxiously forward to hear with great enthusiasm about how this project is proceeding. So I shall pass it on to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you very much, Victor and Alison, for the invitation. I suppose the idea is that I'll talk for a little bit about sort of general stuff, and then Khadija will take over, and then I'll kind of wrap up, and hopefully there won't be any surprises with the media, technology stuff, but we'll see. So what we're kind of talking about in general is this idea of dissident domesticity within prison houses. Prison houses being exceptional, sort of very unusual kinds of domestic space, which function not only as a place of residence, but also as a place of incarceration. And we're sort of interested in two categories of domestic confinement. In house arrest, so a category which encompasses domestic environments in which somebody has been imprisoned by the state, effectively incarcerated by the state, and we're interested in diplomatic asylum, so places where an outlaw or a fugitive seeking arrest or fleeing arrest has turned an extraterritorial zone, such as an embassy, into a domestic space. So has conversely turned this kind of zone outside the state into a home. I'm just realizing that I'm reading from an old version of my presentation, so I'll get the right one up. So our research has focused on how everyday life inside the prison house interacts with outside forces, variously kind of construed outside forces, and how these forces converge on the seemingly innocuous terrain of the home, making their mark on all aspects of domestic existence. So the home, intrigued in how the home becomes a site of what might be called centrality, where the power of the state or of some kind of abstract or tangible sovereign being manifests itself with exaggerated clarity, and where this power is in turn responded to by the kind of inhabitants of the prison house in a kind of reciprocal process. This is the sort of dynamic that theorist of space Henri Lefebvre refers to as a dialectic of centrality, a kind of what he calls a concatenation of centrifugal and centripetal forces which meet on particular terrains. And this is a neutrality which might be repressive, which might be sort of oppressive, but which also, according to Lefebvre's categories, is possessed of a sort of radical potential to act as a kind of vector or a site for radical, subversive or seditious thought and practice. Practices of politics, but also practices of living, potentially, at the same time. So this is something that's often understood. These are, I mean, sort of also informed, our thoughts are informed. The font's gone all funny, but never mind, on sort of historic, iconic cases of house arrest and diplomatic asylum. The one at the top, of course, is Aung San Suu Kyi, who spent a long time under this kind of shabby mansion arrest in Rangoon, and then Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, who was in American embassy in Budapest for 15 years. And then as soon as he left the American embassy, he just keeled over and died, because he was so used to kind of just being there the whole time. And he wrote some very interesting memoirs from within prison, and this is something. This notion of this place of incarceration functioning as a kind of vector, not just of coercion or repression, but also as a place of sort of protest or a forging of a kind of radical subjectivity of the inmate, a place of the forging of a kind of oeuvre or of critique or of some kind of writing or publicity and self-aggrandizement is represented in very much often in relation to the prison. So this is something that a lot has been thought has been put into various things that inmates do while they're in ordinary prison. So from Paul the Apostle via this cheesy picture of Gramsci, all the way culminating in the glorious works of Jeffrey Archer and his 3-volume prison diaries. So I mean, these are things that often we think about in relation to the home, to the prison, but also the same kind of processes happen in these weird home spaces that are kinds of prisons and homes at the same time. So we're interested in how the control apparatus of the state, but also the representational apparatus of mass media and popular culture meet on the terrain of the prison house. And there are of course various bodies of literature that we're building on and that we've been very much informed by in our thinking. So there's been a lot of wonderful stuff written about how state bodies and economic systems cross the threshold into the private sphere to make their mark on the material culture and aesthetics of dwelling. So the works of Victor and Alison, among other people, these notions of geopolitics of the home and of domopolitics have been very interesting for us to think about. And also there's a lot of work on how different kinds of sovereign authority impact on and interact with cultures of incarceration, exile and resistance. So work on exile or on prison. So we're hoping to sort of fuse these two concerns with cultures of incarceration and cultures of geopolitics of the home together to think about the prison house. And the primary case that I suppose we've started to gather ethnographic material of sorts on is the case of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who've been sort of existing under various forms of house arrest in several locations since 2010. The first of which was this kind of twee Norfolk country house, Ellingham Hall, this kind of large mansion on the Norfolk-Suffolk borderlands, where you had this kind of rather odd spectacle of Wellington boots and Argos fusing with this kind of dissident apparatus of cyber dissidents with kind of dodgy laptops with hacker stickers all over them, and these machines of control. So the most ubiquitous one of those being this manacle that Julian Assange had around his, well, not really a manacle because it's around the ankle, but this kind of tag, this electronic tag, which Julian Assange wore the whole time, and which was attached to this kind of monitoring device inside the home, which would be which was a sort of way of keeping tabs on him and make sure that he was living according to the conditions of his bail. So the realities of Assange's and WikiLeaks' everyday existence under domestic confinement have been subject also to intense media speculation. Media and mass culture have frequently portrayed Julian Assange as inhabiting this kind of pathological, deviant domestic sphere. I don't know if this is going to work, but maybe it will. Something rather, beyond the Swedish sex allegations, which of course... Oh, hello.
Assange an ass? Colleague says yes.
Beyond this sort of Oh. Beyond the, I mean, you've seen this one already because we played it while we were trying to get this to work. Do you know where the volume is on this?
That's the volume.
When former WikiLeaks
I'm going to make it quieter because the volume is not really important here. Julian Assange has been portrayed somewhat like the subject of kind of colonial or Western social reformist interventions into domesticity, has been described as inhabiting this kind of pathological, deviant, sort of abject domestic sphere. He's been described as a cat abuser, as a bad house guest, as a bag lady, as a mansion arrest parasite, and generally as a kind of slob afflicted by bad personal hygiene. Bill Keller, who's the editor of the New York Times, wrote a thing about how Julian Assange was alert but dishevelled like a bag lady from the street, wearing a dingy, light-coloured sport coat and cargo pants, dirty white shirt, beat-up sneakers, and filthy white socks that collapsed around his ankles. He smelled as if he hadn't bathed in days. Whereas Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who's a former associate of WikiLeaks, who kind of parted in acrimony with Assange after a few years of working with him, wrote a book describing how Julian Assange used to abuse his cat. Quote, ever since Julian lived with me in Wiesbaden, my cat, Herr Schmidt, has suffered from psychosis. Julian would constantly attack the animal. He would spread out his fingers like a fork and grab the cat's throat. And this was the sort of scandalizing revelation that was placed here. Andrew O'Hagan, who's a well-known writer and novelist, he wrote this text that's for later.
Yeah, I just the cat.
The cat, yeah, that's true. The cat's disappearing. He wrote this. The cat doesn't want to be part of this. Andrew O'Hagan wrote this book. Wrote this long article in the LRB last year. This 24-page article about he was a ghostwriter who was employed to write Julian Assange's autobiography. They also parted acrimoniously, and after that happened, O'Hagan wrote this kind of long expose of his work together with WikiLeaks, and much of it was also devoted to kind of portraying this kind of pathological domestic sphere. So O'Hagan wrote how I noticed he tended to eat pretty much with his hands. I made lunch every day and he'd eat it often with his hands and then lick the plate. In all that time, he didn't once take his dirty plate to the sink. Julian scorns all attempts at social graces. He eats like a pig. He marches through doors and leaves women in his wake. He talks over everybody. I found his egotism at the dinner table to be a form of madness more striking than anything he said. O'Hagan actually goes so far as to explicitly describe, to sort of theorise what it means to be at home for Assange. So at home to Julian means he's fully inhabiting his paranoia and fully suspicious about people and things he thinks are out to get him. But at one point in this text, O'Hagan gets to grips with, I think, what it is that fascinates us as anthropologists, but also perhaps the same thing that fascinates the mass media consuming public about this kind of sphere of dissident domesticity. To quote O'Hagan, it was exciting to think that in this very Jane Austen kind of house, no novel had ever captured this new kind of history where military lies on a global scale were revealed by a bunch of sleepy amateurs 2 foot from an Aga who otherwise had bad personal hygiene and ate like pigs. So there's this kind of interesting, really kind of striking disconnect when having visited these spaces between the sort of weird stuff that's going on here and these very kind of twee spaces in which it's happening. So and it is a response to this kind of to these representations. WikiLeaks has kind of confronted and stage managed its own domesticity to the outside world. So it's also attempted to represent its domestic space to the outside in response. So, for example, Julian Assange hosted this TV show called The World Tomorrow in 2012, in which he interviewed various people, Hassan Nasrallah and kind of the president of Tunisia among them. And this TV show was hosted from this kind of small room in a Kent rental house. By this stage, the house arrest address had moved to Kent, where another bail surety lived. So Assange was living with this other bail surety in Kent in another little twee cottage on the edge of a big estate. And they rented a house next to this Kent home and transformed one of the rooms into a set for this TV show, in which they consciously sort of assembled this kind of material condensation of this sort of aesthetic self-image of dissident domesticity, combining, I mean, you can't see it very well here, but there was a sort of conscious attempt to kind of stage manage a little room which combined the sort of radical ferment of the ramshackle dissident study with this cozy asceticism of the twee English cottage. So there was this conscious attempt to do this kind of set design for this show. At the same time as the show was released, WikiLeaks released this satirical statement containing a preemptive collection of anticipated media smears, which showed how sensitive this representation of the domestic sphere was to them. And one of the statements read, "Assange has tawdry twee taste. He is an interior designer's nightmare." So there was this kind of preemptive, lest somebody attach themselves to this kind of weird thing here. And in this kind of arrangement, I mean, WikiLeaks and its staff came while in Norfolk, into contact with a lot of. It was very conscious how they came into contact with these various sort of technologies of power as well. So how these impacted on the experience of living in the prison house, among which were the curfew arrangements which were imposed by the local police. So Assange had to go to the police station by 11 a.m. every morning and then be back at home by 10. And then you'd have your ankle bracelet and monitoring device around the whole time. This was enforced by Cisco and later by G4S, one of these private security firms that the Home Office outsources a lot of its sort of monitoring and other work to, and they would constantly pay visits to kind of check what was going on. And in this case, WikiLeaks recorded this kind of propaganda thing where they showed how when they tried to film the surveillors themselves, the surveillors started protesting that they couldn't be filmed. We can't be filmed. We can't be filmed, and they sort of left the house. So this attempt to kind of surveil the surveillors, which is actually very similar to something that Ai Weiwei did in a later project, but I'll come back to that in a second. After Julian Assange moved into the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012, he skipped bail and moved into the embassy when the last appeal against extradition to Sweden failed. And then the sort of media interest and all of the kind of processes of experiencing and as well as representing this kind of prison house domain were kind of intensified after moving into the embassy. The living conditions became a topic for intense media speculation, as well as also for management and for representation to the outside world. So far there have been not one but two BBC TV shows inspired by the whole dissident domesticity saga. Last year there's a kind of spy show called By Any Means, and they released one episode about, this isn't a clip because it just sort of screenshots about a murderous, evil, lecherous property developer who, having burnt down a council block or whatever, a block containing his tenants, many of whom died, sought refuge inside the Colombian embassy and stayed there and sort of tried to abuse everybody inside there. And then there's the forthcoming Asylum sitcom about it, which is apparently going to hit our screens this year in February or something, which is now
10th. No, in
February.
3 days. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's exciting. Oh, so we're effectively doing some
PR.
Yeah. Tarnish you with that brush. It's about a narcissistic whistleblower leading a mundane existence inside the embassy of El Rico, a fictitious Latin American republic with a flag resembling Argentina's. Argentina being one of Ecuador's main allies and sort of supporter of the kind of WikiLeaks Snowden axis. And there's also, last year, this embittered embassy-bound Assange was portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch in this big Hollywood flop about WikiLeaks called The Fifth Estate. O'Hagan's also devoted quite a lot of this text to describing Assange sitting in the Ecuadorian embassy, surrounded by hampers from Harrods, but by kind of mountain of hampers from Harrods, which is actually fairly accurate. But sitting inside this sort of prison of his own peculiar making in O'Hagan's representation. The stage management of life inside the embassy is also something that WikiLeaks takes very seriously. Occasionally you have this, because Assange stood for Australian elections last year, and just before that the WikiLeaks party sort of did this whole flurry of self-publicity, so there was this kind of MTV Cribs style hello photo shoot of my life inside the embassy. Occasionally kind of celebrities come to visit, so if Lady Gaga comes or something, then there'll be a sort of photo shoot. And then the most important aspect of this is the occasional balcony appearances. So the balcony appearances are something that happen very rarely. I think there have been only 4 in the 2.5 years that Assange has been in the embassy for. And they're always very carefully planned. It's kind of the only moments when this threshold between outside and inside is passed, and then it's always made sure that a big crowd is assembled and that the makeup's correct, and that this moment of sort of semi-exit is carefully, a lot of sort of thought is put into these things. So in terms of the sort of experience of the of this sort of presence of the state, there's also an intensification here. For a while, everyone going into the embassy, you'd receive a text message on your phone saying "Welcome to Uganda" from a Ugandan phone operator. And the speculation here was that basically the GCHQ or MI5 or something had had a listening surveillance device that was left over from an operation in Central Africa, and they used it in the surveillance van, or in the WikiLeaks context, without resetting it. So before realizing. So for about a week you'd say "Welcome to Uganda" on your mobile phone every time you went into the thing. There are all these listening devices. This is the bizarre sort of thing. This is the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño holding up a photograph of this kind of 1960s style listening device, which was discovered in a plug socket inside the Ecuadorian embassy. So even though they have this police mobile surveillance unit outside with high-tech stuff, they're also discovering these kinds of weird things. So this is something that is also mobilized for propaganda purposes, but also has a constant effect on the sort of organization of space inside the embassy. There's a sort of constant rearrangement of furniture to make it more difficult, in theory, for surveillance to happen, and this constant sort of permanently closed curtains as well inside the embassy. This is just a picture, from one of the side rooms in the embassy that I took the other day of through the curtains, staring right down into a police van, and there's a policeman. You can't see it at all actually, but never mind. It's just like one of these police vans which is parked just outside, and they're always on their smartphones. And this guy, you can't see it here, but he was actually on Tinder at the time. So he was swiping. Online dating while doing, and then over Christmas I had another encounter. There was a sort of Christmas dinner thing, and we went out onto this terrace behind the embassy. There's the kind of terrace where you can smoke cigarettes sometimes, and it faces onto the Harrods office's emergency staircase, and there's always a policeman sitting in the back staircase lest something happen. We were smoking these cigarettes, and he was kind of glued to his mobile phone for about 5 minutes until he noticed us, and eventually he kind of got up and glared at us without moving. And it was this kind of terrifying experience of this sort of surveillance personified in this kind of mundane kind of sort of policeman who's simultaneously very kind of oppressive, but also just kind of swiping through this kind of Tinder, whatever he was doing, Gumtree situation. So there's kind of contradictory experience of what this kind of impact of this stuff actually looks like. But the thing, there is also this constant, I'm talking for too long, so I'll cut down a bit of this, but there's this constant terror of the siege. So there's this, when Assange first moved into the embassy, the William Hague and the government at the time made these kinds of threats that they could rescind the diplomatic status of the embassy and enter. And since then there is this kind of constant terror that some sort of siege might take place, which informs a lot of the kind of conversations that occur inside. Just with reference to, Khadija is going to talk in a second about some other sort of artistic points of reference for what we've been thinking about. One important one of those is Ai Weiwei, who's been under kinds of various forms of house arrest and curfew for the last 4 years, and he did this project called Weiwei Cam, where he installed 5 webcams in various parts of his home and recorded himself 24 hours, so going to the toilet, sleeping, whatever. And this was streamed online, and then after 24 hours the Chinese authorities asked him to take it down. He wouldn't take it down, and then eventually it was blocked. And this was used very much as well by Weiwei to kind of demonstrate that the state, the sovereign, whatever, has to have this monopoly on the means of surveillance, and you can't surveil the surveilled, or you can't kind of interfere with their surveilling duties. And he also did this recreation of his confinement experience in an installation last year at the Venice Biennale and in Berlin, at this retrospective exhibition that you went to. So I'll come back to sort of summarize some of this very disparate stuff that I presented in a bit, but Khadija would like to say some things now about some other stuff. So should I close this?
Yeah. So exactly, we have this theoretical Überbau, in a way, of dissident domesticity, and we're thinking at present about how to turn this into a publication. So that's particularly what we want to talk about once we finish just talking at you and have a discussion. I'm focusing at present more on the representations of dissident domesticity in visual art and film. And I mean, Julian Assange, this case that we're going to focus on, in a sense, as the one case study now of dissident domesticity, is someone who sort of thrives and disdains commentary on him. So that has to background, in a sense, what I say, because I'm thinking about playfully casting the Ecuadorian embassy as a kind of dissident domesticity that is in part like a living room salon for hack writers, with Assange as the sort of salonier. That's certainly not a self-definition, or indeed of any use to the way that WikiLeaks portrays itself in the media, something that we've been studying from the many sources that Michal introduced. But I've been thinking or observing the amount of different artists and writers that have been coming through that room in which he is, as you once very hilariously called it, a sitting duck for artists. So everyone from Sarah Lucas to MIA to a whole stream, and I'm going to talk about some of those people and what they've been doing as a response. I've been teaching in Walter Benjamin, and I found this quote, which I thought I'd share with you to begin with, as a kind of background to where a hacker comes from. The bourgeois apparatus, this is from the author as producer, which was his lecture at the Center for the Study of Fascism in 1934. The apparatus of production and publication can assimilate astonishing qualities of revolutionary themes, indeed can propagate them without calling in its own existence and the existence of the class that owns it seriously into question. Thus remains true at least as long as it is supplied by hack writers, even if they be revolutionary hacks. And I define the hack writer as the man who abstains in principle from alienating the productive apparatus from the ruling class by improving it in ways serving the interests of socialism. And he goes on, and indeed there are these kind of sort of visual hack moves as well. We're looking here at a Swiss duo called Beatnik, who reconstructed unsolicited one-to-one model of the room which we've been showing you press representations of, but this is within a gallery space. As you saw, that was the external view. Now we're inside, and after visiting the Ecuadorian embassy, they took some secret photographs and reconstructed quite precisely that room, which Assange really doesn't want to have represented. But they'd done a project before this, in which they'd put a surveillance device inside a piece of, what did they send him? They sent him a book, a parcel for Mr. Assange, it's called. And the surveillance device inside the parcel recorded all the different moments in which that parcel for Mr. Assange was intercepted and taken apart. So you're seeing here maps of where that parcel traveled, and then photographs of each time it was opened, etc. And so they used that for an exhibition in Switzerland. Another one of the writers that we've been using as a reference is Bruce Sterling, and he wrote, "It's a wrestling match of virtuality and actuality, an interruption of the physical into the digital. It's about Bradley shivering naked in his solitary cage, and Julian diligently typing in his book-lined closet at the embassy, and Ed bagging out behind the plastic seat of some airport in a jet-lag fit of black globalization that went on for a solid month, and those tiny, confined, somehow united spaces are the moral high ground. That's where it is right now. That's what it looks like these days." But in fact, the quote, diligently typed, Julian typing in his book-lined closet at the embassy, was something that confinement actually made difficult. Despite the image of an opening into the interior of the online world as a kind of ersatz universe, in interview, Assange said that it was the experience of being locked in one room that, quote, the brain does not see change, and as the brain is calibrated by moving through space, being in confinement detrains these spatial muscles, end of quote. So these ideas came from his psychiatrist, Mike Kozinski, and the effect of what he sees as his sense of relation, saying that it was, I used to be a good visual writer, as in finding visual analogies in writing. And in this torture report that Mike, the psychiatrist, wrote, he outlined how the intellectual under house arrest will kind of abandon the body and go inward. And these kind of comments about the effect of sense of time as well within that space was something that really astounded me, that the lights were all on timers, so that because the curtains are always shut, in order not to just sleep any old time of day or night, the whole environment is very artificially kind of kept in a certain cycle. The air is artificially circulated, so is the light, and I think Michal will show us some of the documentation in a minute of objects from within that space. But the experience of the space of confinement in the home is also represented in works by other artists, and so we began to speak to different people about collaborating on a larger project to represent the experience of that space, but in an abstracted way. So you're now seeing a piece by Nicholas and Olga Grobspier, who are Polish artists that Michal brought to the project. This is a previous work where they're working with mirrors in a library. And they proposed again to work with this kind of two-way police mirror to draw out a claustrophobic room. Nicholas works especially with architectural typologies and has a kind of thriving photography practice where he has documented different architectures of power, like all the Oval Office reconstructions around the world, things like that. We were also looking at Elm Green and Dragset's work. You might have seen at the Liverpool Biennial 2 years ago. They worked with guards, they work a lot with actors that enhance the kind of psychological effects of architecture. So there was a show at the V&A last year where they also did that, or at Venice where they had the always an array of objects in a domestic kind of complete environment in which you move through and reconstruct the story for yourself as a visitor. So we were thinking about also the operation of surveillance in this context that we're studying. This is Thomas Demand, who became one of our mentors on the project. This is his work Gate, which I always thought was really interesting. It's what he does is from a press photograph of the gate through which Mohammed passed to the one hijacker of the one plane that hit the Twin Towers in Vermont. No, not in Vermont. In where was it? In Seattle? No, Pennsylvania. No, Oregon. Portland. He gets one in right. Portland. This is the Portland gate. I mean, you can't tell because all these gates look the same. But this is actually, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's actually the very gate, the very surveillance camera, the very moment, or not moment because they didn't capture it, of surveillance. And he reconstructs these press photographs in cardboard and then rephotographs them. So what you're looking at is a kind of off copy of that situation of surveillance, which clearly falls apart at various points. Really interested also in the work of Trevor Palin, and this is a collaboration that he's working on at present called Autonomy Cube with Jacob Appelbaum, who also works for WikiLeaks and lives in Berlin. And this Autonomy Cube is a sculpture that's designed to be housed in a museum or a civic space, and then both seen and used. So several internet connected computers are housed within this work, and it's an open sort of Wi-Fi hotspot called Autonomy Cube wherever it's installed, and anyone can join that network and browse the internet. But it doesn't only provide a connection, the sculptures also routes all the Wi-Fi traffic over the Tor network, a global network of thousands of volunteer-run servers, relays, and services designed to help anonymize data. So in addition, Autonomy Cube is itself a Tor relay and can be used by others around the world to anonymize their internet use. So when this Autonomy Cube is installed, both the sculpture, host institution, and users become part of a privacy-oriented, volunteer-run internet infrastructure. And this is something that I think Trevor Palin, I'm going to just show a few other works here, one called Code Names of the Surveillance State, in which it's a video installation that he, the text you can see here projected on, I hope you can see it here, projected onto different buildings composed of more than 4,000 NSA and GCHQ surveillance program code names. And they're kind of scrolling in this endless column, deliberately nonsensical, often droll or sardonic, in these sort of short phrases without really discernible connection to the programs that they designate. Bacon Ridge is an NSA installation in Texas. Fox Acid, an NSA-controlled internet server designed to inject malware into unsuspecting web browsers. And Mystic, you won't see all of these here, a program to collect every phone call from the Bahamas. His earlier work, Trevor Palin, was using or documenting sites like this, which is a classified listening station deep in the forests of West Virginia. The station is located at the center of what's called the National Radio Quiet Zone, a region of approximately 34,000 square kilometers in Virginia and parts of Maryland. And within this quiet zone, radio transmissions are severely restricted, so only omnidirectional and high-powered transmissions really are not permitted. And the listening station, which forms part of the global Elchelon system, was designed in part to take advantage of the phenomenon called moon bounce. And moon bounce involves capturing communications and telemetry signals from around the world as they escape into space, hit the moon, and are reflected back towards Earth. So the photograph is very characteristic of his work, a very long exposure under the full moon light. So he sort of sits there and is really well known for these works where, such as this one called The Other Night Sky, which is a project that tracks and photographs classified American satellites, space debris, and other obscure objects in Earth's orbit. It uses kind of observational data produced in an international network of amateur satellite observers to calculate the position and timing of overhead transits, which are then photographed by him with these telescopes and large format cameras and other imaging devices. So the last sort of spin-off project that I want to show is quite a transition. It's a artist in Melbourne who's also a psychiatrist, who's also involved with the WikiLeaks campaign, who ended up making this very recently, this set of t-shirts or dresses, and they're called WikiLeaks dresses, and I've been thinking about them just the last few days since I got these images and corresponding with her about them. Trying to think about them in terms of the other items of clothing, and I don't know if you've maybe erased the photos of Assange's shoes and jackets and everything out of yeah, we've given this presentation a few times, and we've been called fetishistic and strange for sort of focusing on clothes and various things. But I want to think about, I mean, because she's a really interesting artist who makes these fabric sculptures usually, and I was like, why is she making these WikiLeaks dresses? And I thought one way of reading them, which she very much affirmed, was as a kind of moment of affirmation of culture under this condition of developed capitalism. And I'm trying to reiterate also some of the terms in which we're thinking about these works. And in which I sort of think about a lot of the work which I teach at present as well. So in the avant-garde, there's a tension between two opposed movements, the rejection of capitalism and the accommodation of it. And the best works, I think, are those where that becomes visible. So things like these WikiLeaks dresses are then a kind of find a social location where that tension is visible and can be acted upon. So it's a kind of moment of contradiction that expresses and articulates the conditions of capitalism. One is both, and I'm quoting her now in an email, an enemy of the state and a dupe of the state, and they never know which. In fact, from the state's point of view, we're all potential enemies now. She says the dress is an ironic comment upon fashion that tries to be critical, knowing that it can only be a knot or a contradiction and never free, and yet it exposes or articulates something at the same time. So calling it the WikiLeaks dress is really a way to call attention to WikiLeaks and to give it more mainstream acceptability, or at least to get people to think about it. And this is very much in the context of Australia, where the aforementioned campaign went really badly. Yeah. So the last I now need to go to the PowerPoint. Do you mind navigating me into that? The upshot, in a sense, of what of our research. Yeah, that would be great. And then is in part exhibitions, which I've been. Well, the largest of which was a solo show in Berlin a few months ago at a space called Savvy. And there, I'm going to show you a little bit of what... Well, are you going to talk about this, or am I going to steal your thunder?
No, you do it. That's better, and then I'll just do the sort of wrap-up bit. So this makes more sense.
Okay. Yeah. So, started working with an architect to make a 3D model, which you see here, of the embassy space on one hand. The second room, where you see the policeman that you saw before, is a kind of screening room. And the objects that you see in the circle here are items that are documented from within the embassy. And I think we'll come back to those in a bit of detail. The PowerPoint is having a little bit of problems. While it does, we can talk you, because it was also on the poster that you might have seen through. You see the hamper there that Michal mentioned. You see the manacle and the laptops and so on, which we've talked about. Also bits of furniture and these clocks, which I thought were really extraordinary, that keep the time of different important places: London, Sydney, Moscow, and Quito. Why are we not moving? Do you want to talk about the chairs or the?
Well, we can skip the chairs, but I think maybe it's the video files in here.
Should be okay. I mean, well, anyway, we can keep talking meanwhile.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do was, yeah.
I was just going to say, there's also this manacle thing that this ankle tag, whatever the hand tag, which was it's torn on this slide, and this is something that once Assange was granted asylum by the Ecuadorians, there was this kind of ceremonial ritual removal of the ankle tag. So they got an axe and kind of hacked it off his hand as a sort of gesture of liberation. So it has this kind of occupies this little spot on the mantelpiece now as a sort of gesture of autonomy of sorts.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about the architectural elements most recently, like. When I studied at the GSD, and already then Rem Koolhaas was thinking a lot about how, the wall, the floor, the door, the ceiling, the stair are seen to be evolving in a movement in which the city is increasingly a comprehensive surveillance system. And the house is turning into a kind of automated, responsive cell, replete with devices like automated windows that you can open, but only at certain times of the day, floors embedded with sensors so that the change in a person's position from the vertical to the horizontal for whatever reason will be recorded, spaces which will not be warmed in their entirety, but instead will track their inhabitants with sensors and cloak them with heat shields. So soon, a kind of Faraday cage will be necessary, component of any home, a kind of safe room from which to retreat from the digital sensing and preemption that is already a reality in many of these very digitized surveyed spaces. And the one that we're studying here in the Ecuadorian embassy is a kind of extreme case. On one hand, all the surveillance onto it, but on the other hand, it's kind of resistance to it. So there's loud music of rain or other recordings played inside during conversations to kind of to buffer the sound of yeah, now we're moving, that's good. Okay, we'll come back to this. I'll show you the actual animation if it moves. Boring. Oh God.
What, the actual fly-through thing?
Why don't you, yeah, because I want to talk a little bit about the collaboration with Jessie Shipley, who's another anthropologist, and the way in which we thought about this. But you could also continue, or do you need your slides?
No, I mean, the slides seem, I think they're probably...
Go on to this, maybe? Sorry, we're using the existing laptop, and I don't think it likes our large files. So I really just want to show you this, which is the animation in the first room. Oh God.
Maybe you should press space. I don't know why that would work.
In the first room of this exhibition in Berlin that I did, you come in and you see this film and you hear what, inshallah you will hear, which is a story actually told, quite a contrasting story of house arrest. It's a story from the Seychelles Islands where the British were keeping Ashanti kings in a kind of domestic exile, forcibly though, and based on the archives of their letters, which actually operate very differently to, and are contrasted in the exhibition with the WikiLeaks constant Twitter feed, where campaign is made, of course, and thought about of how to get him out of the embassy. And on the other hand, yeah.
I think you have to close this again.
Close it again? Yeah.
Because it's just...
I can at the end show it from my computer.
Okay.
How about that? Yeah. Sorry.
Do you want to
go ahead. You go ahead, and then I'll show it at the end.
Well, I suppose it makes sense for me to have the other sides. In terms of the thing that would wrap up the sort of core part of the presentation, this is something that we also need. Maybe if I press cancel. Yes. And then this one. So what Khadija was just about to show there before the computer kept sabotaging those attempts was this sort of we were thinking about how to represent this space basically, and this was something, these thoughts we've been developing while we're thinking about representing them intellectually in terms of some sort of research output like a journal article or whatever, but we were also thinking about representing this in an exhibition form at some point. That's a sort of long-term project that has had various permutations, but one thing that we wanted to sort of, I suppose you can pass that around.
I can show you this. This is another collaborator of ours, and
don't nick it there because it's expensive.
It's very pretty. It's the documentation of one of these control order homes, but of an anonymous terror suspect, which this photographer Edmund Clark, who's also very close to Trevor Palin, who I presented, and I knew we would come back to this. But we were handing around the book, which is really an amazing collection of different documents. Also a diary of being in that house.
Which is just to explain, I mean, for a while the British government had this thing called control orders that still exist in some form, but in a slightly altered form, which basically was they could lock up somebody suspected of terrorist activity for an undetermined period of time in a house which they rented for them. And most often they'd choose these kinds of really dreary pebble-dash semi-detached houses on the suburbs of cities in the Midlands to lock these terror suspects up in. So Edmund Clark went to one of these houses and he documented sort of the everyday life without the actual figure in it, because he couldn't take photographs of him, but documented this kind of pebble-dash textured wallpaper kind of mundaneness of this person's existence. And the semi-detached house really sort of caught our attention because it's such a sort of dramatically peripheral thing. These are these little houses that exist on the sort of edges of cities, which stand in sort of direct contrast to some extent with the with Julian Assange's little embassy arrest in the centre of London, in the kind of heart of Knightsbridge, right next to Harrods, and then it also worked quite well in contrast, in comparison with the Seychelles case. So you have these kinds of nodes of this sort of this interaction between the space of the home and some sort of external determinants which occur. So we wanted to basically sort of juxtapose this central Assange thing with this kind of peripheral dreary semi in the Midlands somewhere, to show how these nodes, these kinds of centralities, these spaces of confluence and agglomeration kind of happen in various places. And what we were sort of thinking about as a kind of heuristic, really as a sort of thinking aid when thinking about how to represent this space, which Khadija then developed into this rendering, which a couple of slides showed, and then which didn't work on the other presentation, was this Holbein's Ambassadors, which is very much a painting about agglomerations, about nodes, about passages from one kind of world into another kind of world. And we took this painting, we replaced the shelf that the ambassadors have with this sort of with the Resolute desk from Barack Obama, or from the Oval Office. So this sort of the nemesis space, as it were, of Assange's kind of embassy quarters, and we replaced these kinds of markers of geometric centrality and arithmetic and whatever, and musical instruments from the ambassador's desk with these sorts of key objects that are key objects from Assange's quarters in the embassy that Khadija briefly talked about. But the two sort of key objects that we organised this around are the desk, also the two key objects which Assange didn't want us to photograph when we were doing our documentation. So he didn't want us to photograph the desk, because it was such a central site on which he would sort of focus all of his attention the whole time, and there's also the concern that if we photographed the desk, then there would be too much revealed about what sorts of arrangements, working arrangements there are. So we chose the Resolute desk as a kind of alternative, and then the other thing that he didn't want photographed was the curtain, and the curtain was actually the thing that sort of, in a way, dominates, I don't know, for me at least, this Holbein painting, and it was an exceptionally important thing for Assange, because as he represented it, it's the only kind of, it's a sort of spirit screen which protects this sort of cozy space of the inside from this kind of geopolitical, legal surveillance whirlwind outside. And whereas the door to the embassy is something that's controlled by the British police, the Ecuadorian government, and the sort of private security guard, the curtain is the only real object over which, and the window over which Assange himself has control to divide himself from the outside world. So he said, "This is my curtain. I don't want to photograph." So we took the kind of Holbein curtain as a replacement of it. And when this, in terms of this operation of the curtain, this autonomy to kind of to play with the curtain. This relates, I suppose, to what you were saying about accommodation and resistance. Assange also, whereas he emphasised in sort of conversations that we had with him, and also in interviews he's given at other times, that he doesn't just view this place of confinement as a place as a negative place, but he also views it as a sort of space of autonomy, as a space where his creativity can flourish, and which allows the WikiLeaks operation to continue working. It's a place where no legal subpoenas apply. It's a place where the police can't enter. So it's really a kind of of room of one's own, in which in which he can perform his various operations, write prison diaries, these kinds of things. So there's this double the sense in which this space behind the curtain represents certain opportunities as well. These are these objects that we've talked about already, the ubiquitous picnic hampers, and this is, again, the font's gone all wrong, but Khadisha's already read this quote out. But what we're interested in is what kinds of centralities converge on these houses. What does the revival of this kind of ancient practice of house arrest, which has been going on forevermore? Diplomatic asylum has a very old tradition. There's been a sort of curious revival of both of these practices in recent decades, at a time when supposedly sort of technologies of coercion are becoming more infinitesimal and subtle and more micro and less macro. What does the revival of all these kinds of fairly old-fashioned, kind of vulgar, ancient forms of coercion suggest about the way that the state and its statecrafts and spycrafts operate? So is it really all micro, or is the old kind of big Leviathan still around? And how does it converge on these kinds of spaces? And really, how can a little space, this kind of claustrophobic four-walled little enclosure, cope with all this sort of condensation and displacement, and to what extent can the bodies that are within it cope with those things too? So I mean, yeah, that's a kind of chaotic attempt to summarize.